Hello, my name is Attorney Shawn Smith, and I want to welcome you again to another episode of Law Matters, where we do two things. One, talk about the law and show how it affects your everyday life, but also, most importantly, show you how you can use the law for your benefit and make it easy to understand. Today, I am so excited to have a friend of mine from college, a brother from another mother, I would like to say. But since we're talking about law matters, we have a former legislator here by the name of Ronald Brise. Say hello to my listening audience, Ron.
Hello, audience. It's my pleasure to be here. As Shawn mentioned, I am Ronald Brise, and I work with the Gunster law firm.
And exactly what is the Gunster law firm?
Sure. Gunster is a firm that has been around for over 90 years in the state of Florida. We have 13 offices across the state. We primarily do business law, and we have a government affairs shop in our house, and I head our government affairs shop. And as full disclosure, I am a non-attorney with the firm.
And specifically, what do you do? Are you a lobbyist with Gunster?
I am a government affairs consultant, a lobbyist, and an advisor. Those are the roles that I play on behalf of our clients.
Now, before you got this prestigious job with Gunster, you had to have some background in legislation. Tell our audience a little bit about that background.
Sure. Thanks, Shawn, for the opportunity to share. So I got my start in politics or government in the city of North Miami. Mm-hmm. I got appointed to the Planning Commission in the city of North Miami. And for those who may not know, a Planning Commission's job is to really make recommendations to the full city council on new developments in the city, whether it's houses or apartments or whatever construction is being built. The Planning Commission looks at it. Does it go along with the city's growth plan and so forth, and make recommendations to the city council?
Now, after serving with the Planning Committee, what did you do next?
Sure. I ran for the State House of Representatives here in the state of Florida. I got elected to the 108th District, which is comprised of the city of North Miami, Miami Shores, Biscayne Park, El Portal, northern portion of the city of Miami proper, North Miami Beach, a little bit of Sunnyside, and those were the components of my district. After that, I got appointed to the Florida Public Service Commission, and the Florida Public Service Commission regulates all of the utilities in the state of Florida, whether it's water, electricity, gas into the home, not gas for automobiles, and the telecoms in the state. And so I served there. I got to serve as its chair for a period of time. And so now I'm with the Gunster law firm.
Now let's put some dates around these wonderful experience you had. Now, I remember sitting in my law office, maybe it was like 10, 15 years ago, when I got the word that my college friend was running for office down in South Florida in the Miami area. What was the year at that time that you ran for office and you won that position?
Sure, 2006. I was elected to the House of Representatives in 2006. I served in the House until 2010 and was appointed to the Florida Public Service Commission in 2010.
So being a former legislator from 2006 up until 2010, I'm sure you've seen a lot of bills come into office, a lot of bills come into your desk. What was that experience like when learning how these laws were made and how bills were passed?
Sure. It was a huge learning experience. I think that anyone who ends up being a legislator, no matter if you were a staff person and become a legislator, or whether you're a lobbyist and then become a legislator, or someone who has never had any experience in politics and become a legislator, there is a significant growth curve. Or learning curve. And so just think about it this way. This past session, for example, there was over 3,675 bills that were filed. And so the legislature ended up passing about 275 bills.
Wow.
So you think about the volume of information that any member has to sort of go through. And then there's a committee structure. And so each member is assigned committees, and so you then become the initial decision makers on these bills as they work their way through the committee structure before they get to the floor where everybody gets to vote on them.
One of the exciting things that I like to talk to you about about your time as a legislator is, as I see some of the politicians now that's name is in the news, I may ask you about it. You're like, oh yeah, I remember him.
Sure.
He was in the legislature at the same time that I was. Well, not meaning to name drop, but yeah, go ahead and name drop some of the names that we see around now that you were familiar with at your time at the legislature.
Sure. So I give you the current CFO of the state. He and I served together both in the House of Representatives and on the Public Service Commission. And he's currently CFO of the state of Florida, and that's Jimmy Petronas.
Wow.
You think about some of the people who have gone on to Congress from this area, like Darren Soto. Darren Soto and I served in the House together. As a matter of fact, Darren came in 2008, right? And so we spent time in the House together. They're bills that we co-sponsored together. So as I think of people who are in different positions throughout the state government here in Florida, there's a variety of people that we had the opportunity of serving with. And so one of the things that I think it is a misnomer about lobbying, which goes beyond what information that you're providing, is the relationships that you build over time. So most people who become lobbyists have either been staffers or have been in the position themselves, or have been in and around the process, because you have to know it well to be able to help your clients understand how to navigate it.
One of the perceptions that many of us have in terms of legislation, even from the state standpoint and as the federal standpoint, is that you've got the Democrats who are on one side who stick together, and then you have the Republicans on the other side that may stick together. It's almost like, some may say, like a gang warfare between the two. Is that truly the case? Do you truly hate one another and speak badly about one another, as some of us believe? Or is there some sort of relationship, and do you guys do find common ground that we don't get to see in the public sphere?
Yeah, and I think that the last maybe 8 years have really shown that there is almost political warfare, right? Which is unfortunate, because in the past it has been that, 90% of legislation goes through the process unanimously. Now, at the federal level, I think the intensity is a little bit higher than it is at the state level. I will tell you that this session that just passed, out of the 275 bills that made it through the process, there were probably about 10 bills that really created real debate, and that you had real political animus on both sides of the aisle. But you could say about 260 of those bills that went through the process,
both sides agreed.
Both sides agreed,
Wow.
and they were unanimous.
And again, just to be clear, we're talking about from the state level perspective.
Absolutely.
The federal level, you're indicating that it's obviously a lot,
Right.
a lot different. Now, we talked about your time as a legislator. Tell us a little bit more about your job as the commissioner for public service.
Sure. So in that job, unlike a legislator where you're making policy, as a public service commissioner, you are implementing policy. So you're taking the policy that has been created by the legislature, and then your job is to implement it as is. And if there are issues with the policy, then it is your job to relay that information to the legislature so that they can make those changes. But it's a quasi-judicial role. It's a quasi-trustee role. And you do have a little bit of policy making from the rulemaking perspective. So then there is delegated authority for you to go ahead and say, based upon what the statute is, if the statute provides for you to make rules for adoption, that is where the role of policy making comes in. So, for instance, the only entity in the state that can sort of raise taxes, right, are elected public officials. Well, utilities don't tax, right? But it's rates. And so therefore, rather than having 160 members of the legislature adjudicating a rate case. The commission was created to have people who have expertise in those areas to look at the information that comes in and make decisions based upon what's in the docket.
So yeah, let's break that down a little bit. You
Sure.
talked about and you mentioned that in reference to raising rates, that would have to go through your Public Service Commission. And when we're talking about raising the rates, we're talking about raising the rates on what, to be clear?
On consumers. So for instance, if you are an electric customer or a water customer, the power company comes in and says, look, we have X projects that we would like to build out. Population has grown, so therefore we need additional plants. We need additional transmission lines. We need additional feeder lines. We need to strengthen and harden the system in order to be able to withstand hurricanes and so forth. So what would happen is that they would come to the commission with a plan for that. And they would have whatever the amount to accomplish or execute that plan is. So then the commission then would look at all that information, similar to a trial, and so we would go through the hearing process. We'd hear from the public, and there's an Office of Public Counsel, which is created by the legislature to represent the interests of consumers. And then you have other consumer groups that can intervene in the process. And all of that information is presented during the hearings, and ultimately the decision is made by the commissioners on what should happen. Now, the commission staff creates a recommendation after synthesizing all the information, and commissioners decide whether to go with the staff recommendations, make adjustments, or so forth. But these are billion-dollar rate cases that come in before the commission.
So, and we're talking about commissioners. We're talking about the commissioners on the Public Service Commission.
That is correct.
And public service includes water, light. What else am I missing?
So it's water, right? Water and wastewater to the home, electricity to the home, natural gas to the home, right? And then you have telecom services throughout. The only distinction with telecom services is that the commission no longer regulates that in terms of pricing or anything of the sort. There is a provision to regulate service if a person is a lifeline customer. And so a lifeline customer is one who receives a credit from the federal government through the Universal Service Program, which they get $9.25 per month. So what happens, the Universal Service Administrative Company, which is a board created by Congress that is sort of under the Federal Communications Commission. And so if I'm a customer and I'm coming in and I qualify for Lifeline, then whoever is providing me the service then gets the $9.25 directly paid to them, and they provide me service equivalent to $9.25 for X amount of minutes per month or X amount of broadband per month and so forth. So the Florida Commission is responsible to make sure that those entities are providing service, good service, within the state boundaries.
So when I think about, you talk about the public service entities, I'm thinking of a monopoly board.
That's correct.
Where we have waterworks, we've got the energy, and if you land on those things, you have to pay certain fees to the monopoly. And the Public Service Commission essentially regulated.
It regulates, it acts as the market. It acts as a substitute for the market. So therefore, rather than, because there aren't 4 or 5 companies competing, and so therefore, as a monopoly, technically the companies could raise the rates independently if you didn't have a board that regulated or sort of oversaw what they were doing. So the commission acts as that stop and make sure that they're providing one, good service, that the service is safe, that it's reliable, and it's done at reasonable rates.
So the good thing about the commission that it acts as a stop, but then also it acts as a go as well, because when my energy bill in Florida goes up or my water bill in Florida goes up, it cannot go up unless that commission went through unless that agency went through your commission to get approval.
Correct.
So you've approved that raised rate that I now have.
Correct.
So that extra $10, $15 I pay per month, I have to thank, well, not you anymore, but I have to thank that commission for allowing my rates to go up.
Correct. And one of the benefits of that, and no one wants to pay higher rates, but one of the benefits that you will notice in this country versus some other countries where you don't have a system that works as well, is that our infrastructure, at least for these type of things, is generally well run.
Yes.
And so therefore there's predictability in terms of how the system will run in 10 or 15 years. You can see a good example of a system falling apart in Texas, for instance. So they deregulated.
Right.
And so you have a perfect example of how when there are failures in the regulatory system, what happens, and we notice what happened in Texas over the winter holiday, over the past winter, where you had people paying $16,000 for limited service because they're going on just-in-time market rates. Mm-hmm. And what that means is that if I'm in the business of providing you energy, if economics basically says that if something is scarce, then the price goes up.
Right.
And so therefore that is in part what happened in Texas. And then you didn't have the hardening necessary to make sure that they could withstand the type of winter that they had. Hardening costs money. Mm-hmm. And so if you don't have those incremental raising of rates,
then we have a Texas situation.
Then you end up with a Texas situation.
I see. So I'm thankful that we are thankful for the commissions to prevent us from that scenario. One of the things, other things that I wanted to bring out is, when you indicate that when the rates are raised, they first have to have a hearing. So if I'm a member of a citizen of the state of Florida, am I entitled to go to these hearings and speak my piece and have my voice be heard on this as well?
Absolutely. When there is a rate case that is proposed, there are dates that are provided, and the members of the public will show up. And I remember when I was in the commission, there were some of those public hearings that would last 10, 12 hours.
Wow.
Because people would come and sort of express their support or their opposition, or in many cases you had people who were neutral on it, but they just wanted to voice that either service was good or service was bad, but they had the opportunity to do so.
So, where do these hearings take place when they're getting ready to raise my rates?
So it varies, right? So it's generally the commission that identifies locations to have these hearings. A lot of times they're on college campuses or at high schools or at places where that can hold a large capacity of people.
And where do I find out when these are taking place and where they're taking place? I mean, last time I checked my Facebook and social media, I didn't see those announcements on there.
So generally people have to go to the Public Service Commission website, or depending upon how in tune the local media is, because I remember when I was there, we used to feed all this information to the local media, and some local media would be diligent about it and put it up on the 6 o'clock news or a noon news or morning news. The PSC does have a Twitter feed. They do have, I think they may have a Facebook page. And so if you're not a follower of the PSC, you may not come across it. But that's something that's always been a challenge, is making sure that people receive the information, considering the number of people that are served by the commission.
So the first bit of advice we'll give our listeners is if you want to keep track on what's happening with your local energy rates, with your public service rates, go to the Public Service Commission website. They may or may not have a Facebook page. They probably have Twitter.
They have Twitter.
And let's follow them so we know when these hearings are going to take place, so we can have our voice heard, whether or not we are for or against my rates being increased.
Sure.
Beautiful, beautiful information. Now we've gone through your legislative work. We've talked about your service as in the Public Service Commission. Now you work at Gunster, being a lobbyist. Now you know that lobbyists have a bad, they're worse than lawyers when it comes to their reception. But is it really as bad as people think? Are lobbyists is really as terrible as many of us seem? I mean, you're one, and you're a great friend of mine, so I can't think that's the case.
Sure. So let me sort of explain what a lobbyist does,
Yeah.
right? A lobbyist advocates on the interest and positions of their client.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I go in and meet with a legislator, my job is to provide the information about either a piece of legislation or a component of a part of a legislation that is of interest to my client. Now, what I typically do is say, look, this is what we care about. This is what the law is today. If the law were to be changed, this is what it will do. We support it because, or we oppose it because, and this is who opposes it, and this is why they oppose it. And so we would really like to convince you to support our position. If you can get there, we certainly appreciate that. But what's most important for me to know is, what is your position? Because at the end of the day, my job is counting votes, right? And helping people get to the position that I would like them to be at. And so that is essentially what my job is. And so other than that, if we have legislation that we would like to have filed, then we go in and we engage with legislators across the state. We introduce our clients to legislators so that they can understand the process, because a lot of times people who are in business may not fully have an appreciation as to how the process works. So we go through that process, and then we shepherd an idea through the process.
So that's a great segue into, you said many of your clients don't understand how the process works. And I believe many of our listeners don't understand how the process works. So explain to us how the process works. Let's take, for example, that our listeners are your clients for the purposes of this moment. How does the process work, and how can I utilize it to benefit us?
Sure. So you're a business owner, or you're a citizen, and
Right.
you've identified a problem. And you wake up one morning and you say, you know what, there ought to be a law, or there ought to be an adjustment to the current law. And so you identify specifically what change needs to happen. You can come to someone like me and say, okay, this is what's going on, and I would like to change it to this. So then, we have the know-how to determine what statute, what chapter, and what language would get you to where you want to be.
So the first thing you do, the first thing a lobbyist does is identifies a particular statute that would address that issue. But then also, after they've identified the statute, they determine what changes need to be made to the statute in order for your position to now become law. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. So then, in looking at that, then you make a determination. Is it really a law that needs to be changed, or is it a rule that needs to be changed? Right? Is it a state law that needs to be changed, or is it a county ordinance that needs to be changed? Is it a city ordinance that needs to be changed, and whatnot? So you go through that process. But let's say we go through all of that and we determine that it is a state law that needs to be changed. So you identify it, then you work on language, and you go through the language, and your client gets comfortable with the language that accurately reflects what they would like to see done. Then your responsibility as a lobbyist then is to identify or socialize the idea with legislators, right? And there's many ways to do that. You can do that at a public forum. You could do that by engaging with individual legislators. And so once you've gotten the sense that there could be some support to moving that idea, then you find a sponsor. So you go through and you engage with the people that you've been engaging with, legislators, and you find a House sponsor and you find a Senate sponsor. And then once you find one of each, and then you give them the language if they agree to sponsor it, and then they begin their process of providing the language to the House staff or the Senate staff, and so that they can get a bill actually drafted. Once the bill is drafted, it gets a number, And then the bill begins to get assigned to committees.
Now, you said you come up with the language. What do you mean by they come up with the language? Are they essentially writing the statute or the proposed statute that they would like to see implemented?
Right. They're writing the proposed concept.
Okay.
And so you put it in the language as close as possible to what you want it to be in statute, so that there's less work for the committee staff or the House staff to put it together.
I see.
Because once they get it, they will revise it based upon how they're writing the language, right? And once that happens, then it truly is in the process.
So the lobbyists provide the building blocks necessary, gives it to to both a House member and a Senate member if they believe that the bill has some traction. Then once a House member and a Senate member sponsor this bill, it then goes to different subcommittees for them to work more on the language. Is that accurate?
Right. So what happens if the language then goes to the committees and it gets voted up or down or amended, or whatever changes will happen at each stop. And once it goes through that process, if there is no fiscal, and what I mean by fiscal, there's no money attached to it, then it goes straight through policy committees. If there is a fiscal attached to it, then there is appropriations committees that are attached to each silo of policy.
Wow.
And so once that happens, then let's say you go through each chamber, right? Through the committees, then it makes it to the floor.
All right.
And on the floor,
now, how does it get to the floor?
After you have positive votes
in the committees,
in all of the committees, then eventually you make it to what is called the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee is sort of the gateway to the floor. So the Rules Committee really manages the schedule of what's going on to the floor. So there's a lot of bills that make it to rules
that don't end up on
that
the
end
floor.
up dying in rules.
No,
right?
I'm thinking about, and I know we've been talking about the state legislature, but I'm thinking about, for example, in federal legislature, a lot of people during the Republican Senate, a lot of people were upset with Mitch McConnell because he wasn't letting things come to the floor.
Regular order.
Right. How does that compare to the Rules Committee in the state legislature?
So the structure is similar, right? In the federal legislative process, it's very similar. So you go through the substantive committees, and ultimately you go to something equivalent to rules. But in state legislatures and in the federal legislature, the most powerful people are both the Speaker and the Senate President, right? And depending upon how close the margins are between the minority and the majority leader becomes almost as powerful as the majority leader, right? Because you don't want to put anything on the floor that's not going to pass.
When you say you, referring to who?
The majority leader, right? Or the Senate President or the Speaker of the House, right? So you want to make sure that there's enough votes. So there's a lot of work that goes into at that rule level, right? So a lot of times you'll have the majority leader working with their members to make sure that there's the numbers there to pass it. Now, if the majority leader really doesn't like the idea, it may not see light of day unless there's enough pressure that is put on by their membership in order to force it to the floor.
So that's where I guess you and I, everyday average citizen, comes to play. If we can understand what laws are in the subcommittees, we can then call our legislator and say, listen, we support this bill. We want you to let the majority leader know that you're going to vote for it, and that will then help persuade the majority leader to let that particular item come to the floor. Is that accurate?
That is very accurate.
That's why we see different advertisements. Call your congressman, call your state legislature today to let them know that you support this bill. But it seems a lot of times that these bills that are coming through, I mean, average everyday citizen doesn't know what's happening. Is there any way for us to get caught up to say, okay, what bills are going to the floor that maybe I may care about?
Yeah, that's always a challenge. One, because you think about Florida, you think about where the legislature actually is in session. It's in session in Tallahassee, and it's in session in Tallahassee for 60 days.
Wow.
And so you have committee weeks before the session actually begins. So just for everyone to know, in election years, session begins in January, and that's state election years, right? So in January. In non-election years, session begins in March, and it's 60 days from January basically to March in election years. From non-election years, it's from March until May. Mm-hmm. And then you have committee weeks beforehand. So unless you're tuned in and plugged in, you're probably not going to be paying much attention. But that's why you have organizations, community organizations such as the NAACP, your chambers of commerce, the Urban League, whatever associations you're part of, whatever professional association you're part of. And very often your homeowners association will pay attention to things that are of interest to homeowner association type things. So the more plugged in you are to these groups, the more in tune you're going to be with the things that matter to you.
Gotcha. You got to stay connected. Especially to the organizations that are relevant to you to see what's happening. Now, we talked about I paused it when we talked about the legislation coming through the Rules Committee. Let's say it makes it to the floor. Once it makes it to the floor, per what you said before, the majority leader knows if they have the votes. They're not going to bring it to the floor unless they know they have the votes, right?
Generally
speaking.
So
if it comes to the floor, it then is passed by. It comes to the floor of the House and the Senate. It's passed by both chambers. Then what happens next?
Sure. After it passes both chambers, then it goes to the governor. The governor has the opportunity to do three things. The governor can sign it, and it becomes law that way. The governor can allow it to become law without his signature.
How does that happen?
So the governor has 30 days to act on it. And so whether, if it's one of those things that he is not particularly interested in and doesn't want to put his signature on it, but it may be of interest to the leaders, both the Senate president and the speaker or either one of them, then it may be one of those things that he just allows to become law without his signature. Or the governor can veto, right? And so the governor then vetoes it, and the legislature has an opportunity to override a veto, with I think it's 2/3 or 3/4 majority in each chamber for that to happen. That rarely happens in Florida, simply because the way the numbers are in terms of the majority and minority in Florida. Now, just so that everyone's clear, ultimately, you can pass something through the process, and the governor can come and say, okay, that is not something I agree with. And he vetoes it, and that's it, right? The other thing that I failed to mention before about the legislative process, the only bill that is required by law every year for the legislature to pass is a budget.
Yes.
Is a balanced budget. This year, the budget was over $100 billion. And so with that, the veto power is a little bit different, right? Unlike a regular bill, the governor either takes the whole bill or vetoes the whole bill. He can't say, well, I want to keep this portion, keep that portion. The budget, the governor has line item veto power. So there are sections of the budget that the governor can say, you know what, this project or this amount, I'm not approving. I'm not approving that amount, or I'm approving this amount, and so forth. So the governor has a lot more flexibility in terms of the use of the veto power with the budget.
Wow. Thank you so much for that instruction. One of the things that we've learned here on this particular podcast is essentially how these bills start with lobbyists and make their way to the legislature. The legislature then brings those to the floor, and then ultimately they're voted on by both parties and then signed by the governor.
So let me sort of gently make an adjustment there.
All right, push back just a little bit.
Just push back. So I think all bills begin with a citizen, whether they are an individual person or whether they are a business.
Yes.
Now, the business may employ a lobbyist to help them further their interests, or a citizen may gather their neighbors or motivate or activate their association to help move things. But lobbyists seldomly say, Ronald Brise, as a lobbyist, I'm coming in to move legislation or to help generate legislation around a subject, because frankly, I'm supposed to not have a personal interest in what I am.
But I appreciate that gentle pushback, because it allows us to see as listeners how the power comes from us. The lobbyists will do what we ask them to do to help them to push our ideology. So if we as members of a group or citizens of our society gather together enough individuals and members, and also money, we can employ or utilize the efforts of a lobbyist to get done what we want to get done. We retain lawyers to help us in the courtroom, and then we can also retain lobbyists to help us in the legislative room. Correct. And I so appreciate that instruction. Do you have time to join us for a second podcast so we can go into some of the specific legislation that we have seen and how that affects us as well?
Absolutely. Whenever it makes sense for us to get together again.
So I want to invite you to stay tuned for part 2 of this podcast, where we talk in more detail of specific legislation that has been passed recently and how that affects you in your everyday life. Thank you.